So tremendous welcome back, everybody. I have an abject apology to make. We ran out of coffee cups. I'm terribly sorry about that. I hope that the fascination of the programme alone will keep everybody focused and alert for the next hour or so. So we're very fortunate now to move on, and Carla Deacon, who is the Associate Director of the Diagnostics Assessment Programme at NICE, will be telling us about NICE and its role in the development of the clinical care pathway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me clearly? Yes? Okay, so again, thank you very much, thanks to Christine, for the invitation to come and talk here today. If you see me looking a little bit rigid, I've been warned something unexplainable will happen if I come outside of these sorts of lines. It's like doing one of those sort of games, really, where you mustn't cross over the lines. I am a bit of a wanderer, so I'm going to be trying very hard to fight my natural instinct to wander around. There's been some really interesting talks this morning, and from my perspective now, what I do share with the people that you've heard speaking earlier certainly is optimism and enthusiasm for seeing how we can make things different, how we can drive things forward. And I make no apologies, and Sally and Fiona are very, very aware of my allegiances. I'm completely diagnostics balmy. I've spent my whole career in diagnostics. I started out again in biochemistry, so there's a sort of a theme going on here. And I've had a lot of time in the commercial world, in the IVD diagnostics world, before changing into health economics and coming to NICE very, very late in life. So what I'm going to talk about is interesting. When Christine gave me this title, I got on the phone to Christine and I said, so what is it you actually want me to talk about? So what I've put together is potentially a little less high-powered than what you've seen previously. But what I'm trying to do here is to think very, very much about what the role of the clinical pathway is, the care pathway, because it's fundamental, and to show you how fundamental it is to so many of the things we do at NICE. And then what I'm going to do is take a little detour into diagnostics and thinking about that, how it contributes to this area of stratified, precision, personalised medicine, and a little bit of what we do in the Diagnostics Assessment Programme and some of the work we've done around companion diagnostics as well. So hopefully it won't take us too long and it'll be a bit of context setting for people. So not going to spend too much time on this, but just to make sure everybody in the room sort of understands where we are at NICE. The summary here is that NICE has been around now for 17 years as an organisation. And over that time, its remit has changed. So we started out as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, then we became the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and we're now the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And the reason for those changes is about different sort of responsibilities and areas that have come under NICE's wings during its time. And the real key here for us was in 2013, because with the new Health and Social Care Act, we actually moved out of our role as a special health authority within the NHS to become an independent arm's-length body, reporting, if you like, sponsored through the Department of Health. So what do we do? And if you say this is a slide that a lot of people use in NICE, and it actually summarises very nicely what the aims of the organisation are. And I think that will resonate very, very much for things that we've heard spoken about already today. So it's about, as it says here, clinically and cost-effective interventions. Now, interestingly, from a health economics point of view, cost-effectiveness actually includes clinical effectiveness. However, because of the implications that people hear when they talk around cost, we always do tend to say clinical and cost-effectiveness, even though we're sort of double counting ourselves. So that's one of the key things we're looking at here. And it's about rational use of services. So we heard those thoughts earlier about warfarin, and we heard about how we could use different types of medicines at different stages for different patients. So it's thinking about how we rationally use everything, because at the end of the day, there is a fixed budget. And everything is about opportunity cost. So if you think about when people talk about the threshold that NICE applies for the Department of Health, that's actually the opportunity cost of the healthcare system. It's what you forgo if you take this intervention on, what you forgo somewhere else in the system. This, I think everybody, it's at the centre, and certainly in everything we do at NICE is at the centre of what we think about. It's about equity. It's about equitable access to healthcare. And also, this brings us potentially very, very close then to where we're talking. It's about new and innovative technologies. How can we use those or help the introduction of those to achieve those aims? So those are our aims, but how do we actually do that? Very simply, we produce evidence-based guidance, quality standards and performance metrics, and we also have a range of information services, so BNF, the NHS Information Service, many of those things sit within NICE's remit. But probably to talk a little bit more about what we want to say about clinical pathways, we have to think a little bit more about how NICE is put together. And this is a large organisation. And having been there 2 years myself, I still am putting some little pieces into place. But very simply, it's split into three, if you like. So there is a Health and Social Care Directorate, and it does what it says on the tin. It produces social care guidance, it produces public health guidance. You then have the Centre for Clinical Practice. So this is what people will most commonly know as guidelines. So if you have a nice clinical guideline, it will have come out of the Centre for Clinical Practice. And any of you that watch the BBC News will often see the director, Dr. Mark Baker, making his morning appearance on the TV, talking about what's gone in there. And obviously here you will often see Gillian Leng, Professor Gillian Leng, who looks as a director of that piece of centre. So the part of the centre, and it's not larger simply because that's the part of the centre I come from, but I think in terms of the conversation we're going to have, the part of the centre, the other centre here is the Centre for Health Technology Evaluation. And again, it does what it says on the tin. It evaluates healthcare technologies. There are lots and lots of different programmes in there. Most people will probably be familiar with technology appraisals. So when we heard earlier about the NOACs, or the DOACs or the NOACs, they will have been looked at within technology appraisals. But we have a number of other programmes covering different things here, as well as support, scientific advice support to a fee-for-service to industry to help in understanding how to collect data. And for me, I live in this area here, in what's called the Medical Technologies Programme. So there are two programmes there, and this is the programme that my heart lives and where we're going to perhaps focus a little bit more lately. But the reason for showing you this is this actually is about how clinical pathways are used, and what you will see is that clinical pathways are used all the way across those areas. So I've thought I'd go on the internet, because that's what we all do, and I thought I'd try and find out what the key words were around clinical pathways and care pathways, because we all talk about them so much, but I just thought, what was the definition? There were lots of different things, but these were the words that kept coming up, certainly when you did it through Google when I looked. And they all make perfect sense. And having to have a clinical care pathway is fundamental to the work we do at NICE, because everything has to be thought of within a pathway context, because you can't evaluate something thoroughly and understand what its impacts are going to be, both in terms of cost and in terms of patient benefits, unless you are looking along the whole journey, if you like, that the patient is going to be taken. So what I've got here, and we'll talk a little bit more about, is some of the examples of that. So I've picked familial hypercholesterolemia because I thought that was something that might be raised a few times today. So this is what you see here is something called NICE Pathways. So I think that gives a really, really big clue. And essentially what NICE Pathways does, if you've not ever looked at this, is it takes all the different pieces of guidance from all the different areas of NICE and attaches them to a clinical pathway. So if you go on there, they are listed, and you can see at a glance how everything that NICE is producing is actually linked in to help with the pathway. And those things that are linked into here will come from a number of areas. So what you will see here, you'll see the clinical guidelines. Now, primarily, that's possibly where we develop our approach to clinical pathways. But you'll see those pathways then pulled through the technology appraisals and pulled through the diagnostic assessment and those other technology areas that will be using pathways to think about impact. So just about how do we get to those clinical pathways? And what was very interesting, I was listening to what Munir was saying about the challenges of trying different trusts in different hospitals. It's very difficult to find a standardised clinical care pathway. Very, very difficult. And I can tell you as we move on a little bit of my own experience of that in our programme. But how do we get to these pathways that are seen in all of our products? So when a clinical guideline is commissioned, it's commissioned from the Department of Health to the Centre for Clinical Practice. So the Department of Health asks NICE to produce a guideline on this particular area. So then it's down to the Centre for Clinical Practice, for the teams working on that guideline, the collaborating centres working on that guideline, to try and work out what that clinical pathway is. So this will be done over in this area. So there will be a guideline scope because it will have come down from Department of Health and there'll be an initial look to see what this covers. It might be the complete pathway, or it might be diagnosis, it might be monitoring, it might be management. And that has to be looked at. But then, whatever the decided scope is, based on what's come down here, a pathway outline has to be developed. And there's several different ways of pulling information into that. So, you'd start with literature. What's in the literature? Also, professional body guidelines. So often there are professional body guidelines there that a lot of work has been put into. So those will be taken into consideration. We also use our expert committees to think about this, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's so specific in diagnostics later on. And it will also, as I say, the pathway we're looking at, depending on whether it's going to be diagnosis, whether it's going to be management, whether it's going to be monitoring, will drive what comes out of that. But essentially, the simple process is there's an outline pathway which then goes into the guideline development and then goes into guideline publication. So when that happens, for the rest of us throughout NICE, whenever we're looking at a topic, the first thing we will always do is see what the NICE guidelines say about it. What do the clinical guidelines say? Because again, the evaluations we're going to undertake will be looking through the prism of the clinical pathway. In my case, in diagnostics, we will look at the impact a diagnostic technology has all through the pathway, not just at the diagnosis stage. We will be following it all the way through to understand all the benefits, or possibly decrements to quality of life, and also effects on mortality, and we'll also be thinking about all the resource usage across that pathway. So that's in simply how we work. Now, if we're in a programme, it's not an ideal situation. We've done things in the diagnostics programme where there hasn't been a nice clinical guideline. So then, as you would expect, we go back to what you saw before. We look at the literature. We look to see what professional bodies have put in place, and we also looked at expert committee members to help us through that. But when all of these come together, as I say, I showed you pathways at the beginning, and this I think is central to our commitment to try and help people understand how everything fits together, is in the clinical pathway. So if you actually go to that website, and I think I've put the web address there, what you will you'll get a choice, you'll get letters, which area you're in. There's a whole list. I'm thinking we've got somewhere around 200 clinical guidelines, plus all the other things that are coming out of the programme. So there's a lot of stuff to bring in around clinical areas. But what you will see is you'll see a right-hand banner, which will ask you to look at different places. So what I've done here is I've just took screenshots, just as an example going through here. So it says at the top there, overview, in this case familial hypercholesterolemia, overview. Then the next one says, I think it's on, I can't even read that from here myself. It looked like ongoing. This is when you have to stand in one place. So diagnosing. So what you see here is how these pathways come up. And if you actually then click on these areas, it will open up the relevant piece of work from the other parts of NICE. So you can see how it all fits together. And just likewise, those are the final two. So you can go through and you can see everything that's there. And I suppose the point being, back to what we said about everything is about a pathway, because we have to be able to follow things through and understand their impact. So I wanted to perhaps bring it a little bit closer in and think a little bit more where we are today. So I think Fiona had covered this, and it's very interesting. I was working collaboratively with NHS England and Monitor over the last year on something, and we raised this question of what's the right terminology. And I got the job of going off and hunting the internet yet again for all those definitions. And we came back to the case that there might be very, very tiny semantic differences, but everybody's talking about these all in the same way. So they're all synonymous terms. So how, in this area, how do we think about that at NICE? So again, here's my sort of play to the message you've heard from Fiona. It's about the whole of diagnostics. It's about utilising all the info we have. So the area perhaps we've focused a little bit more on this morning is talking around the genomic, the genetic testing, those types of areas. But they sit within this whole envelope of diagnostics that can actually provide information and help that process of getting the right treatment and the right diagnostic to the right patient. the reason I've put this in, this is a general, and I think for diagnostics it's really important. We recognise how exciting the genomics area is, but a lot of the challenges in genomics are actually challenges for diagnostics per se, particularly in the evaluative methodologies. So I think it's a really key message to perhaps not get sort of wound into the thought that things are really, really, really specialised around genomics. A lot of the challenges in terms of how you evaluate their effectiveness and how you put are challenges that we have for some of the more basic diagnostics as well. And that relates to the fact that the way diagnostics actually work themselves. So very quickly, I'm going to skim this bit. This is just telling you how we currently get our diagnostics in the diagnostics programme. So our diagnostics are brought to us primarily at this point by the industry. They are then evaluated, and a selection decision is made by something called the Medical Technologies Advisory Committee, who are there looking through a number of lenses to decide if this is something of value to the NHS, should we invest public money in evaluating this, what's the disease it's affecting, what sort of population is it affecting, and all of those things will help a selection decision. So this is just showing that this is how we get things into diagnostics. We also, in diagnostics, do accept something called clinical notifications, and quite a lot of our work now is coming from that area. So it's from clinical pools. So it's about, when we were talking about earlier, how do you get things thought about and taken up? It's possible to bring these technologies to us directly. Again, this is just to show the sort of thinking that goes on, because a lot of this thinking is the same for any diagnostics as it would be when we're trying to think about what's happening in the personalised, precision, stratified medicine area. So, again, interestingly, is the clinical pathway complex? And I think, again, that's the message I'm sure most of you would recognise, that clinical pathways are often very complex. But all of these other things here, it's about does this is going to have an effect? How is it going to affect it? And the reason that the committee, this is meant to represent what's going on in MTech's head when they're listening to the cases that are being brought before them, because they need to make a decision on what type of methodology they will use. So in our programme in diagnostics, we actually do full clinical and cost effectiveness. And that is for a number of reasons. So it's sort of thinking about what those reasons are, and again, how they would apply in the genomics area. So here's one, we've sort of said about this, which sort of chimes with our thoughts on clinical pathways. The complexity and variation and how a diagnostic and care pathways are, how these technologies are used to actually make clinical decisions that affect patients' management or treatment varies hugely. And that sometimes you can't capture in a very simple cost analysis. These things here, again, will still apply for genomics as much as they apply for more basic diagnostics. We're talking about real-world implementation. So we heard Munir talking again about having done the RCT, but now I need to do something that looks at this in a real-world context. This one, I think, is very, very prevalent. It's rapid technology movement, rapid things going on. It's about the level of evidence as well. So that's very interesting, because in this very, very fast-moving area, how does the level of evidence around those diagnostic technologies get put together? But another thing that's very interesting to think about is also, is the regulatory piece for this? Because certainly I will tell you I have a very good relationship with my opposite number at the MHRA. And they are spending a lot of time trying to think their way through this. So generally, the regulations for IVDs are being recast at the moment. We will have a new IVD regulation coming through very shortly. We're just waiting for the European Parliament to do what they need to do to it. But again, how do you apply that in the field of genomics? There are some challenges there, but they're not a million miles away from the challenges we see generally for diagnostics. And this comes back then to that question about why the pathway is really important. So for us at the moment in our programme, our entry point, to be even considered for selection, you have to have a CE mark. That's the regulatory mark for diagnostics. So again, how does that get applied in a situation where we're using genomic technology? And again, what we do is we say we look through the pathway through the lens of that diagnostic product. And as you might expect, these are the reasons why we do it with clinical and cost effectiveness. because it's all about the complexity of the pathway. It all comes back to the same thing. How are we going to unpick all of that and work out where the benefits and where the costs are accrued? This is a very simple slide. Now, I put this together really for a different purpose, but it's thinking about this point again here. One of the things we have to use a lot in diagnostics, and it comes back to these evidence bases, is the fact that we have to link evidence together. And what that means is taking evidence that we're more familiar with in the diagnostics area around diagnostic accuracy. And because we haven't got those end-to-end studies that you often see, even Munir said they weren't looking at long-term outcome studies. They looked simply at time in therapeutic range. You've got to find a way. We could say, well, actually, no, we need to do proper RCTs on this. Technologies move on so quickly. And also, how much time has the system and how much money has the system now got to keep going down this a very, very long ways of looking at things? It doesn't mean they're not going to be done properly. It's about new methodologies and ways of doing that. But the way we handle that at the moment, we use the same approach as they use in Australia, the Australian organisations use for HTA in diagnostics. We link together what we know about how well that test works in clinical accuracy, and then we use the linking of the literature through a model to help us get to the outcomes we want, which is we were talking about in terms of mortality, quality of life, cost, etc. And again, this is just a very simple to show you what our process is, but again, it's to show you here why the pathway is important. So this piece here, it takes us 12 weeks in our programme to get the scope together. That's our decision question. It takes us 12 weeks to actually hammer down the decision question. And a huge part of that is getting the pathway. So as I said, at that stage, we're looking at what's in NICE clinical guidelines. We're also looking at professional bodies. But we're often eliciting from some specialist members. So for every topic we have in diagnostics, we have standing members and we bring together a group of specialist members, and they again will be lay members. They will be clinical people who are actually living this pathway along with the patients. And very interestingly, my very first experience in NICE at a scoping session was we sat in a room, we had 6 urologists and 6 different clinical pathways. Then we had to look at the guidelines. It was quite an effort. And that just, again, goes back to the importance but the challenge around clinical pathways, how we actually bring those together. So this is really important for us, and that's where we look at the pathway. During the assessment phase, our assessments are done by academic centres. So what I call the academic heavy lifting. We actually use the same people who do the evaluations for drugs. But for us, they do an even harder job. They don't just critique the case that's given to them. They actually go out and they do the systematic review of clinical and cost effectiveness for us. And remember, I talked about the linked evidence modelling, which is about how things happen along the pathway. This is what these guys are doing at that point in time. They're gathering the evidence. And where there aren't end-to-end studies, which is a very frequent thing in diagnostics, they actually then model that together. They build a model and they put that evidence against the pathway to help us understand what goes on. And then at the end of it, again, our committees will be looking at this evidence and be thinking about things, and they will be listening to what patients say of their experience along the pathway as well. Very briefly then, it's just to touch more on the sort of the area of precision medicine. And again, another word that was on the picture I showed earlier, as you see, I'm like Fiona, I do like a picture, particularly a colourful one, is around this area of companion diagnostics. Because companion diagnostics, that's what we're talking about here. We're actually talking potentially about precision diagnostics. That's what we're actually talking about. How does a diagnostic help that stratification process? So we have experience of looking at this in NICE, and we actually have 2 different ways we can do this. And that will depend on the complexity of whether that test was actually used during the clinical trials for the drug, whether it's been developed separately, and what the evidence bases are. But essentially, we can actually look at a companion diagnostic when we evaluate the drug. So I think we've done that for about 15 drugs to date. So you will see that in our evaluations. But what you will often find in real life is that there'll be the diagnostic that was used in the clinical trials. There will then be alternatives or different diagnostics that can do the same thing, the same value proposition in the pathway, but they weren't included in the clinical trial. And they all might act differently or behave differently in a routine environment. So where there are multiples and where we need to look at them individually, they actually come to the diagnostics program. So we've had a look, and it's interesting. We've done EGFR testing. We tried KRAS testing along for cetuximab. However, just as we got to the end of our evaluation, the marketing authorisation was changed to include NRAS. So we'd sort of been superseded by the process. And we've also looked at complementary diagnostics, such as the Oncotype DX, looking in breast cancer adjuvant therapy. So there's a lot of things going on in there. So I know that's sort of a whirlwind tour, but I think the message is out of it for me, really, is that clinical pathways are critical to everything we do at NICE. From the point of view of diagnostics, back to Fiona's point, it's about using all of it, the genomic information and everything else we can to stratify. And it is really about precision diagnostics. It's about diagnostics playing their role as this piece of medicine goes forward. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into what we do. So thank you very much.